There are several security frameworks that a company could use in defining their security compliance and privacy policies. Certainly ISO 27001 and ISO 2702 have been around for a number of years and are used by a number of companies to help promote their security practices. NIST Special Publication 800-53 and 800-53A, it's a adjoining audit program, has been used by federal contractors and government agencies to protect their enterprises or establish the security practices that protect their enterprises for a number of years. Importantly, the NIST cybersecurity framework that we're looking at here, as well as ISO 27001, 27002, and the NIST Special Publication 800-53 provide a tremendous number of security practices that you should consider putting into place to secure your enterprise. However, even though these have been around for a number of years, many companies still haven't developed a security plan to protect their enterprises, or the security plan that they have in place is not sufficient. There's too many gaps in the types of practices that they should conduct. This is concerning, particularly if companies are part of the critical infrastructure. President Obama signed an executive order defining a national policy to enhance security and resilience in the national infrastructure. The executive order encouraged efficiency, innovation, economic prosperity, promoting safety, security, business confidentiality, privacy, and civil liberties, at the same time creating a partnership between the public and private sectors. It did not call for new regulations, but it did call for the Attorney General, DHS, and the Director of National Intelligence to develop practices for sharing information. It also directed NIST to develop a voluntary framework. The cybersecurity framework draws upon existing security practices. It's not a one-size-all-fit framework, and we'll look at that in a few minutes. So many firms, large and small, are adopting the framework. And no matter which framework you look at, there are basically 5 key principles for cybersecurity risk management that you want to focus on when you're designing your security policy. Identify, protect, detect, respond, and recover. If you think about it, this is sort of the cycle that you would use in cyber defense. Identify a problem, protect your company from that problem attacking you, detect it, respond to it, and recover. So if we look at each of those elements inside the NIST cybersecurity framework, you literally have a checklist of things that you would like to have in place in your cybersecurity plans. So in identify, understand the organization and cybersecurity risks to systems, assets, data, and capabilities. Inventory your applications, hardware, and data, and identify your sensitive data. In essence, you want to identify what it is that you're protecting. Map your organizational communications and data flows so that you understand how they properly flow. And prioritize assets as to criticality and business value. Which assets are the most critical to your operation and have the most business value to your operation, and which are less critical. Identify and address cybersecurity risks, establish cybersecurity roles and responsibilities, establish business functions for the delivery of critical services, establish resilience requirements. What is it that you need to have in place so that critical assets can be brought up as quickly as possible? And how would you respond, or what are the requirements for your response in a critical situation? Understand and manage legal and regulatory requirements, including privacy, and document and identify asset vulnerabilities. Protect, implement safeguards to deliver services. So what is it that you want to put in place to protect your infrastructure? Well, manage identities and credentials for authorization and access to accounts and devices. A very critical aspect of protecting your network is knowing who should be on the network, who's authorized to be on the network, and making sure that those credentials are kept up to date. When an individual leaves the company, what are your policies and procedures for removing that individual's access? Incorporate network segmentation. Inform and train all users, particularly privileged users and senior executives. So, again, security awareness is a requirement for many compliance obligations, but it's important that people understand what security is on your network and how they are part of it. Protect data at rest, in transit, and during processing. Implement data leakage protection. Data leakage is simply how data can leave your company from different areas, like it's being emailed out by a customer service representative who's trying to communicate with a client, or credit card data is being sent out by email from one company department to another company department, and it's not encrypted, etc. Formally manage assets throughout removal, transfers, and disposition. Separate testing and development networks from production networks. This is very important. Typically, we have less security restriction in the testing and development networks, so they should be separated from the production networks so that you have no crossover from those less protected areas into your live data. Establish a software development life cycle. Establish a change control process. Change control processes are very important in a company to be able to understand the impact of changes on your network, and to give people a opportunity to see what changes are taking place. Establish and test your backups, and develop and review the audit logs. Detect, continuously monitor the organization's systems and networks to more quickly become aware of incidents. Analyze detected events to understand attack targets and methods. Aggregate and correlate event data from multiple sources. Determine the impact of events and establish alert thresholds. That we tend to have so many alerts that pop up that are either false positives or are which are just common activity that really has no impact on the security of your network. And you want to be able to set those thresholds so that you see the things that are important to see as your as you go day to day on reviewing your network, and not be bogged down by the less important material. Detect malicious code and unauthorized mobile code. Perform vulnerability scans. And when you perform your vulnerability scans, make sure that you set up mitigation plans and have individuals assigned to those plans with dates when things will be corrected. Test detection processes, communicate event detection information to appropriate parties, and continuously improve detection processes. Respond, develop and implement a cybersecurity incident response program. Execute your response plan during and after an event. Report events consistent with established criteria. Share information consistent with response plans. Coordinate with your stakeholders. Understand the impact of an incident and perform forensics. Now, performing forensics doesn't mean you necessarily perform the forensics unless you are trained as a forensics specialist and have the capability in your company to do a forensic examination properly, which means all the way from acquisition of the data through the preservation of the data after the investigation is completed. It's not as simple as it sounds to conduct a proper forensic investigation, so that should be left to experts. categorize incidents consistent with response plans, contain and mitigate incidents, and mitigate and document newly identified vulnerabilities as accepted risks, and incorporate lessons learned into response plans and update response plans. And recover, develop and implement a plan to restore networks and systems after a cybersecurity incident. Execute a recovery plan during and after an event. Now, one of the things to keep in mind with the recovery plans is as they are developed, you should test them, you should train on them, make sure the people who need to respond understand what their responsibilities are long before you have to execute your recovery plan. Manage public relations, repair your reputation after the event, communicate recovery activities to internal stockholders or stakeholders, the executive and the management teams, and continue to incorporate lessons learned into the response plans and update your plans as needed. Again, the NIST cybersecurity framework is not a one-size-fits-all strategy. That's a lot. We looked at all of those activities, and for a very small company or a company with not a lot of security resources, that's a lot to do to ensure that your company is safe. So the NIST framework actually looks at what they call implementation tiers. And they're based upon the company's rigor and sophistication and, quite frankly, budget to be able to implement all of the actions in the NIST cybersecurity framework. Tier 1 is considered what they call partial. So in other words, you don't have the full plan into effect, but you have aspects of it. The risk management process is not formalized, and it's managed on in an ad hoc basis. The integrated risk management program has limited awareness of the cybersecurity risk at the organizational level, and the risk awareness process has not been established or is at best irregular. And for external participation, the processes and practices are not in place to work with other entities on the cybersecurity practices. So you may think this is considered only by smaller firms to be Tier 1, but believe me, there are larger firms that have insufficient practices to protect themselves, and more importantly, may have insufficiently designed practices to protect themselves, which may very well have them still down in the Tier 1 level. So how does one determine if they're in this tier? Well, you can look at all of those cybersecurity activities that we listed for the NIST security framework and check off which ones you have into place. You're basically doing a gap analysis and then determine what can you put into place. Tier 2 is risk informed. So for the risk management processes, they're defined but not fully implemented across the organization, but you do have some risk prioritization. The integrated risk management program shows an awareness of cybersecurity risk at the organizational level, but there's not an organization-wide approach to managing those risks. And you are risk informed, and you do approve processes and procedures. And as these are approved, they're defined and executed. And the cybersecurity information is shared with the organization. External participation is a little bit above Tier 1. You're aware of your role in the larger ecosystem, but it's not, you're not really executing processes in a formal way to share that information externally. So how do you move from Tier 1 to Tier 2? Well, that goes back to that understanding what the gaps are and executing from there. In Tier 3, we have the risk management processes defined and expressed in policy and regularly updated. You have risk prioritization adjusted for changes in business requirements and threats. Your integrated risk management program shows an organization-wide approach to managing cyber risk. You have risk-informed policies and processes. things are implemented as intended and reviewed, and you have consistent methods in place to respond effectively to changes in risk. External participation, you understand what your dependencies are with partners, and it enables collaboration and risk-based decisions in events. So imagine what you need to do then to move from risk tier to tier 2 to risk to tier 3. Tier 4 is adaptive. Your risk process is adaptive security practices based on lessons learned. You have continuous improvement and active adaptation to evolving threats. Your integrated risk management program is organization-wide. You have risk-informed policies and practices. The cybersecurity risk management is part of the organizational culture, and you share data and risks with partners to ensure accurate current information is distributed before an event occurs. The question then becomes, is it necessary to move from tier 3 to tier 4? You'd have to look at the cost, the budget, and the organizational resources necessary to do that. Last point is the NIST cybersecurity framework is voluntary. The framework is becoming a de facto standard of care for companies, and government organizations have integrated the framework into their operations. I know a number of very large companies in New York that do use the NIST cybersecurity framework as opposed to, say, ISO 27001 or NIST 800-53.